The other thing that is so obvious in these three pertinent ideas, he talks about our description of the alcoholic, the chapter to the agnostic, and our personal adventures before and after have been designed to sell you three pertinent ideas. A, that you're alcoholic and cannot manage your own life. Step one. B, that probably no human power can relieve your alcoholism. Part of step two. C, that God can and will. What is so apparent now is all the information necessary for steps 1 and 2 are to be found in the doctor's opinion, the first 4 chapters of the big book Alcoholics Anonymous. People come to us today and they say, well, how do you work step 1 and 2? And our answer is you don't. They are not working steps. They're not action steps. They are conclusions of the mind that we draw based upon the information presented to us in the doctor's opinion in the first 4 chapters. You see, I've always been powerless over alcohol. My life's always been unmanageable because of that. I just did not know that, nor did I know why, until I read the doctor's opinion in the first 4 chapters. There's always been a power greater than I am that can restore me to sanity. I just did not think that power would do so, nor did I understand the insanity I had to be restored from until I read the doctor's opinion in the first 4 chapters. After having read those chapters, if I can say to myself, you betcha, I'm powerless over alcohol, my life has become unmanageable, then I'm through with step 1. If I can say to myself, having read those chapters, doctor's opinion in those first 4 chapters, I have come to believe that there's a power greater than I am that can restore me to sanity, then I'm through with step 2. And it's not by accident. The very next statement says in the big book, being convinced of those vital issues, steps 1 and 2, it says we are now at step 3. He also says if you're not convinced, you better go back and reread the book up to this point because you've missed something. And if you don't want to do that, he said, well, then you just might as well throw it away. Because you can't go on with step 3 through 12 unless you got 1 and 2 behind you. Now see, this is the mistake in telling newcomers to start with chapter 5. Because chapter 5 starts with step 3. And it's hard to start on 3 unless you got 1 and 2 behind you. And it's hard to get 1 and 2 unless you've absorbed this information in the doctor's opinion in the first 4 chapters. Joe?
The book goes on to say, being convinced of steps 1 and 2, we were at step 3. That doesn't mean we're ready to take step 3 yet. We're just at step 3. So he told us how it works. Now he's going to begin to tell us why it won't work. Which is that we decided to turn our will and our life over to God as we understood Him. Well, just what do we mean by that, and just what do we do? Need to know and understand a little bit about that. We're going to turn our will. And what is our will? Our will is our thinking. And our life is our actions. I'm going to make a decision to let God direct my will and my actions. I'm going to make a decision to do that. I haven't done it yet. I'm just going to make the decision. I'm going to let God do that.
Okay, we believe in step 3 there's 3 key words that, like so much of the other stuff, we need to understand them as the writer understood them in order to be able to get the full import and the full amount of information coming out of step 3. And the first is the word decision. He made a decision to turn our will and our life over to the care of God as we understand Him. And I hear people today in AA say, I've been in AA 5 years. My life's still all screwed up and I don't understand why. Because I turned it over to God 4 years ago when I first came to AA. Took step 3. And our answer back is, no, you don't turn anything over to God in step 3. You make a decision to do something. And the word decision itself implies that there's going to have to be some further action taken to carry this thing out. You know, a good example in my own life. A few years ago, my wife Barbara and I, we decided to go to California and visit some relatives that live in Los Angeles. But we didn't do anything to carry that decision out. And sure enough, we didn't get to California either. Second year in a row, we made the same decision. Again, we did nothing to carry it out. And sure enough, that year we didn't get to California either. Third year in a row, we made the decision. Only this time it was a little different. This time I took the car down and had it serviced. Barbara packed some clothes and a little food. And we got in our car and we drove from our home to Tulsa, Oklahoma. Then we drove to Oklahoma City. Then we drove to Amarillo, Texas. Then we drove to Albuquerque, New Mexico. Then we drove to Flagstaff, Arizona. Then we drove to San Bernardino, California. Then we drove to Los Angeles. And you know, by golly, one day we ended up in our relatives' living room visiting with them. Not because we made a decision, but because we took the action necessary to carry out that decision. And a little later on, our book is going to say step 3 is a vital step, but it will have little permanent effect unless at once followed by a strenuous course of action. Steps 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11 will eventually bring us to step 12. So all we're really doing in step 3 is we're just making a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understand Him. Now, what is our will? Well, our will is nothing more than our thinking apparatus. Our will is nothing more than this thing up here in my head that tells me what to do and what not to do. My will is nothing more than my mind. A good example of tying the will and the mind together. Let's say that some of us are beginning to approach the ends of our lives, and a few of us in this room are. And we get concerned about all the material things we've gathered up through our lifetime. What's going to happen to us after we kick the bucket? And if we get concerned enough, we'll go sit down with an attorney. And we'll tell that attorney what we want done with these things. I want this to go to my spouse, this to my daughter, this to my son, so on, so on, so forth. Now, that attorney will take my thinking from my mind and write it down on a piece of paper in legal terms. And I'll sign it, and maybe the attorney will sign it as a witness. And they stick it in a safe somewhere. Now, a year or 2 or 3 later, sure enough, I kicked the bucket. And if my family's like most of them, they're going to call that undertaker and say, come get him. Let's get him ready, and let's get him out to that cemetery about as fast as we can. Just 2 or 3 days. Hell, used to, they waited a week when they could. Now then, it's just 2 or 3 days. And they take me out to that cemetery, and they put me in a box. And that box is suspended over a hole in the ground. And hopefully somebody will be there that'll say a little prayer or so. And I hope it'll be somebody from AA that does so. And they start dropping the box in the hole. Now, if my family's like most of them, they're not even going to wait till the box gets to the bottom of the hole. They're going to jump in the car, and they're going right back to that attorney's office. And that attorney is going to get out that piece of paper and read to them what my thinking was 2 or 3 years prior to that time when I was sitting there in their office. Now, we know they call that piece of paper a will. It's not by accident. Will, thinking, mind are all synonymous. They all mean the same thing. And by the way, as far as we know, we're the only species here on earth that's ever faced with this decision. The other species here on earth, they don't have this thing called self-will. Whatever they do is on God's dime, God's direction, and on God's will. For some reason or other, He felt it necessary to give we human beings this thing called self-will. And He allows us the choice as to whether we're going to operate on self-thinking or whether we're going to operate on God's thinking. And we're the only species we know of that is faced with this decision. Now, what else am I trying to turn over to God? Well, I'm making a decision to turn my life over to the care of God as I understand Him. And the step originally said over to the care and direction of God as I understand Him. Now, what is my life? Well, my life is nothing more than my actions. What I am right now, as of this moment, sitting behind this table, is the sum accumulative total of all the actions I've taken throughout my entire lifetime. Has made my life what it is right now today. Now we know all action is born in thought.
Say that again, please.
All action is born in thought. Sometimes we react to a situation so rapidly we think we do it automatically, but we don't. I can't even reach out and pick up this cup of coffee unless my mind tells my body to do so. So if all action is born in thought, then it stands to reason my life is going to be determined by how I think. If my thinking is okay, chances are my actions are going to be okay, and chances are my life's going to be okay. But if my thinking is lousy, then chances are my decisions that I'm going to make are going to be lousy too. And the actions that I take are going to be lousy, and life becomes an absolute living hell. I shall never forget when I got into step 3. And I went to my sponsor, a fellow named Neil, great guy. Been sober at that time down near 20 years, and that was a long time ago. I said, Neil, I don't believe I can take step 3. And he said, why? And I said, because if I turn my will and my life over to the care of God as I understand Him, I have no idea what He would have me be. And He may want me to be a missionary. And He may want to send me to China. And I sure as hell don't want to go there. And he just laughed. And he said, well, let's look at it this way. He said, at least it wouldn't be in the hands of an idiot, would it? He said, Charlie, let's look back in your lifetime. You've always been a selfish, self-centered, self-willed human being. You've always done what you wanted to do whenever you wanted to do it. You've never paid any attention to what anybody else wanted, what God wanted, or anything else. Is that right? And I said, well, yeah, you know that's right. And he said, well, the end result is your life has become an absolute living hell. He said, there is no way that God can make it any worse than you've made it. He said, you might as well take a chance on it. And he stepped back about 3 feet and stuck his bony old finger right in the middle of my chest. And he said, now you've got to make the decision. He said, I wish I could make it for you, but I can't. He said, this is the one you'll have to make yourself. And he got it through to me in such a manner that I began to understand that if I continued to operate on self-will, my life was never going to get any better. In fact, it was probably going to get worse. And based upon what he told me, And based upon what I'd read in the book, I made the decision to turn my will and my life over to the care of God as I understood Him at that time, Joe.
Remember yesterday we talked about precisely, specifically with clear-cut directions? Well, the clear-cut directions are starting to come with us right now. We'll see a lot of directions as we go through the next few pages. Here's the first one. The first requirement is that we be convinced that any life run on self-will can hardly be a success. On that basis, we're almost always in collision with something or somebody, even though our motives are good. Most people try to live by self-propulsion. Each person is like an actor who wants to run the whole show. Is forever trying to arrange the lights, the ballet, the scenery, the rest of the players in his own way. If his arrangements would only stay put, if only people would do as he wished, the show would be great. Everybody, including himself, would be pleased. Life would be wonderful. Now, isn't that true? If people would only mind me. I got a wife. She's 37 years off and on we've been together. She hasn't minded me yet. I don't believe she's going to. But we have trouble when I force my will or try to force my will on her. We have lots of trouble. See, what I didn't know that I know now, that everybody has a will. That's the problem. Everybody's got one. And my will for her is one thing, and her will for herself is another. And every time I try to force my will on her, we have problems. I have to learn to not do that. The first requirement is that we be convinced that any life run on self-will could hardly be a mistake, hardly be a success. I have to let God direct my will, you see. He told us how it works, and He just tells us how it don't work, why it won't work, because of trying to force my will on other people. It just don't work.
Now here's Bill again, using an example of what he assumed we already know about to get his point across. Bill is from New York City. The stage is great in New York City. And he knew if he talked about the actor, people would understand him. And today I know that all of us, as we grow up, we begin to draw a little script up here in our head as to what we're going to be. And we're going to grow up and we're going to do this and we're going to do that and we're going to do this. And everybody's going to look at us and say, oh my God, what a great fellow that Charlie is. And not only do we draw a little script in our own head for our own life and actions, but we do it for those around us too. I drew a little script in my head for my wife. And she's going to do this and do that and do this and do that and be that. And people are going to look at us and they're going to say, oh man, that Charlie is married to a great, great woman. What a great man he is for picking her out to begin with. I drew a little script in my head for my children. And they're going to do this and they're going to do that and they're going to do this and they're going to do that and they're going to become successful. And people are going to look at him and they're going to say, oh my God, wasn't that Charlie a great father? He must be a great man to have kids like that. Now the only thing I didn't know is my wife had drawn a little script in her head that didn't necessarily match mine. My children had drawn a little script in their head that didn't necessarily match mine. And they began to do and say things that I didn't think they should do. I thought they ought to be doing something else. And rather than back off and let them become whatever they needed to be, then I began to enforce my script on them. And my life became an absolute living hell. And it wasn't just my wife and children, it was my co-workers. It was my neighbors. It was everybody around me. I always knew what they needed to be doing and was always trying to force my will upon them so things would turn out good and look good for me. Page 61, first paragraph. Well, what usually happens? The show doesn't come off very well. He begins to think life doesn't treat him right. He decides to exert himself more, put more pressure on him. He becomes on the next occasion still more demanding or gracious as the case may be. Still the play does not suit him. Admitting he may be somewhat at fault, he's sure that other people are more to blame. He becomes angry, indignant, self-pitying. What is his basic trouble? Is he not really a self-seeker even when trying to be kind? Is he not a victim of the delusion that he can wrest satisfaction and happiness out of this world if he only manages well? Is it not evident to all the rest of the players that these are the things he wants? And do not his actions make each of them wish to retaliate, snatching all they can get out of the show? Is he not, even in his best moments, a producer of confusion rather than harmony? Our actor is self-centered, egocentric, as people like to call it nowadays. He's like the retired businessman who lolls in the Florida sunshine in the winter, complaining of the sad state of the nation. The minister who sighs over the sins of the 20th century. Politicians and reformers are sure all would be utopia if the rest of the world would only behave. The outlaw safecracker who thinks society has wronged him, and the alcoholic who's lost all that is locked up. Whatever our protestations, are not most of us concerned with ourselves, our resentments, or our self-pity? Does that sound familiar to anybody in the room besides me?
That brings us to another point about what is self-will. I didn't know what self-will was. They didn't talk about those things in the bars I hung around, so I didn't have any information about it. I come into AA and I'm asked to think about my self-will. Now, in the third column of the inventory process, it says what part of self is affected. And I didn't know what part of self was affected. And as I will talk about that a little bit now, I got to that point in the inventory process. I don't know what self-will is, so I just skip over that. Because that means nothing. He didn't put it in there for nothing. But about 12 or 13 years later, in Bill's experience, with an awful lot of conversation with a bunch of learned people around the world, he began to get a bunch of more information on what causes people to have self and how they use it or don't use it. And in the 12 and 12 of the 12 and 12, in the area of the fourth step, the first 2 or 3 pages or 4 is some of the best information that you'll ever find based upon the understanding of what is the self-will. And when I get to that point with people in our working of the steps, I have them go to the 12 and 12 and get that information from the first 3 or 4 pages to get a working knowledge of what is self and how that affects us from that. And then later on we can do that third column that's in the 4th step area. Because I didn't understand it and most people don't. And
we got to face the fact that when Bill was writing the big book in 1937, 1938, and 1939, Bill was not a great spiritual giant. He was a New York City stock speculator. He was not a great student of human nature. He was a night school lawyer. He did the absolute best that he could do in the big book Alcoholics Anonymous. And he wrote one of the most spiritual books the world has ever seen. Surely, surely, God used Bill's hand to write this book. But 13 years later, after he had worked with many, many alcoholics, after he had talked to some of the greatest spiritual minds in the world, Bill knew more about what he was talking about. And he made the decision to write this thing called the 12 and 12. There's always been questions about why did he write it. I think 2 or 3 reasons. Number one, he had so much trouble in the early 1940s trying to get the fellowship to accept their traditions. I think he felt if he could put the traditions together in a book along with the steps, that people would accept the traditions more readily. But I think the real reason he wrote it is he knew more about what he was talking about. And he could see some blank spots in the big book. And he could see some things he needed to explain further. And he sat down and he wrote the steps in the 12 and 12. Now, we do not believe the 12 and 12 is meant to replace the big book. We do not believe you can work the steps out of the 12 and 12, simply because there's no directions in there on how to work them. The only directions on working steps is in the big book. But some of the information that he added in on the 12 and 12 opens our minds up and makes it much easier for us to work the steps according to the big book Alcoholics Anonymous, if we really understand and accept what he's talking about. In fact, he himself said they're not there to replace the big book. That they're a series of essays designed to give us additional information. One of the greatest books in the world, I think. And this thing in chapter 4, in the 12 and 12, he begins to explain the basic instincts of life, those things that are God-given, and they're absolutely necessary for survival of the human race. The only problem with the satisfaction of those basic instincts of life is such a pleasurable thing that people always overdo in those areas and end up creating problems and harms and hurts and pains for other people. And then they have to suffer the retaliation that comes from the other people. And if they don't retaliate, they've got to suffer the guilt and remorse that comes from some of those things. It's plain that a life run on self-will can hardly ever be a success, because under those conditions we're always in collision with people, places, and things. Now we're going to look at a little picture for just a few minutes. We're not going to do the 12 and 12. We just want to talk about this one particular thing in the 12 and 12. And if we see that information and accept it in our lives, not only does it make it easier for us to do step 4 when we get into step 4 in the big book, but it really explains why we need to do step 3 and why we need to make this decision. And that little picture is titled The Basic Instincts of Life, which create self. And Bill talks about the 3 basic instincts of life. He talked about the social instinct. He talked about the security instinct. And he talked about the sex instinct. And he said these 3 basic instincts of life are God-given. And they're absolute and necessary for survival of the human race. Therefore, they are a good thing. The first one he looks at is the social instinct. He said all human beings are born with a desire to join together in groups with other human beings. All human beings are born with a desire to be liked, to be respected by other human beings. He said if we didn't have those desires, if we cared nothing for each other, that after a while we'd go into a dog-eat-dog situation. Complete anarchy would reign. And sooner or later, under those circumstances, the human race would fail to survive. So these desires that you and I have to be liked, to be respected, to be recognized by other people, these desires that we have to come together in groups with other human beings is a God-given thing, and therefore it is good. And he used several terms under the social instinct. He uses the term companionship. And that's nothing more than wanting to belong or to be accepted by other people. How many of us, when we grew up, were always on the outside of the crowd looking in, scared to death of what other people were going to think of us, scared to death to say anything or do anything because we knew it would be wrong and people would laugh at us and they would not accept us as part of the group. he uses the term prestige. Now, prestige is wanting to be recognized, to be accepted as the leader of the group. And the world needs leaders. Somebody has to make decisions. Somebody has to say, John, get behind that tree with your club. Mary Jo, you get behind that bush with your spear. And Billy and Jack and I'll run this sucker through here and we'll kill him and we'll have somebody's got to do that. And most people will take one of two directions. Either let me be a part of, or let me be the leader of. In either case, it's going to be based upon what other people think of us. If they like us and respect us and recognize us, then we can do those things that we're wanting to do, whether it be just companionship or prestige. Self-esteem is what we think of ourselves, high or low. And usually what we think of ourselves is based upon what other people think of us, or what we think other people think of us. If they like us and accept us and respect us and we become a part of, we feel pretty good toward ourselves. If they reject us or we feel like they rejected us, we feel pretty lousy toward ourselves. Self-esteem. Pride. I'm glad I got in the habit of going to the dictionary. When I was a young fellow growing up, all I ever wanted to do was a man who walked tall with pride and a little bit sideways like John Wayne did. That's all I ever wanted to be as a boy growing up. Now, one day I went to the dictionary and I looked up the word pride. And it says it's an excessive and unjustified opinion of oneself. And it's not true. And it can be either too high or it can be too low. In either case, it's a form of pride. Personal relationships. That's nothing more than our relations with other human beings and the world around us. Ambitions. Ambitions are our plans for the future to gain acceptance, to gain power, to gain recognition, prestige, and etc. So as we grow up, we have to decide up here in our minds, what do I need to do and what do I need to become in order to have other people like me and accept me and respect me and etc. Society teaches us those things as we grow up. We watch the adults and we see what they do and we see what they say and we see how they act. And based upon what we see as we grow up, then we draw the script in our head. And we begin to set goals for ourselves so that we can become whatever it is we think we need to become. And these goals will vary in different parts of the world. One part of the world is to have a good education. Another part of the world is to be a large landowner. Another part of the world is to be the best fisherman there is. Another part of the world is to have a large family. It can be any number of things. And based upon what we see and what we're taught, we set the goal. Now, if you're going to reach the goal, you're going to have to work at it. You can't just be a bum and sit on your duff and have people like you and accept you and respect you. You're going to have to work at becoming whatever it is you've decided that you want to be. By the same token, you're going to have to make some sacrifices. Now, there are some things that I would love to do as a human being that are really, really exciting and a lot of fun. But if I do them and you catch me at it, you're not going to like me at all. And I don't think you and I would do the work necessary to reach the goal, nor make the sacrifices necessary to be accepted, unless we got a reward for doing so. And the great reward is that we get at the moment of successful completion of the goal. We've worked and we've worked and we've strived and we strived and we finally reached the goal. And they pat us on the back and they say, "Oh, Joe, you're a fine fellow. You're a smart man. You really, really are doing good." Bill said in his story, "I had arrived." And this praise and this recognition we get from other people is one of the most wonderful experiences that a human being can possibly have. The only thing wrong with it, it seems to be just a temporary feeling. You no sooner reach the goal, get the praise and recognition, you feel good about it, but after a while you look around and you say, well, is this all there is to it? And we set another goal. And we work and we work and we strive and we strive and we sacrifice and we reach the new goal and we get the recognition, the acceptance, and etc. And it feels great, but it doesn't last very long. And we set another goal. And it seems to create within we human beings an insatiable desire for more and more power, more and more recognition, more and more acceptance. And we're not getting it fast enough. They're not giving it to us the way we think they ought to. So what do we do about that? Well, we start taking shortcuts. We start doing a little lying, a little conning, a little manipulating, a little climbing on other people's backs and stepping on their toes. And the instant we do so, we create pain and suffering for other people. They in turn retaliate against us and create pain and suffering for us. Plain little life run on self-will can hardly ever be a success. Because under those conditions, the fulfillment of this basic instinct is so pleasurable that we always overdo and create problems for others. He talked about the security instinct. And he said all human beings are born with a desire to be secure tomorrow. He said if we didn't have that desire, we wouldn't provide the food, the clothing, the shelter, the things that we're going to have. Next drought season, we would just starve to death. Next winter, we would freeze to death. Now, I know in AA we try to live one day at a time. But I also know nearly everybody in this room has got an insurance policy. And the purpose of the insurance policy is to protect ourselves in the future. That is a basic, God-given desire. And if we didn't have that instinct, if we didn't provide the things that we're going to have for the future, then sooner or later the human race is going to fail to survive. And just like the social instinct, somewhere as I grow up, I've got to make some decisions about, well, what do I need in order to be secure? And this is going to vary in different parts of the world. One part of the world you need $4. Another part of the world you need 4,000. Another part of the world you need 4 million. Another part of the world you need 192 coconuts. Whatever it is that they use to measure, trade, and barter with. And based upon what we see others do as we grow up, then we draw the script. And we begin to make our plans for what we're going to have in order to be secure. Maybe our plan is to have a good automobile to start with. Maybe it's to have a good home. Maybe it's to have new furniture. Maybe it's to be a large landowner. Maybe it's to be the owner of a company, whatever we decide. And we set the goal and we start working toward that. Now, you can't sit on your duff and be a bum and be secure tomorrow. You're going to have to work at it in order to reach the goal. By the same token, we're going to have to make some sacrifices. I can't blow everything I got today and be secure tomorrow. And I don't think you and I would do the work necessary to reach the goal, nor make the sacrifices necessary if we didn't get a reward for doing so. And the great reward comes again at the moment of successful completion of the goal. How many of us have we grew up set those goals? Mine was for a bicycle. Somehow I managed to scrape together $4 and bought myself a used bicycle. And I was the only kid in the neighborhood that had a bicycle. My God, what a great feeling that was. Later on is to have a car. And we get that car and we get it paid for and nobody can take it away from us. What a great feeling that is. Later on, it's a new home. Later on, it's furniture for that. It could be any number of things. And the day we reach the goal and nobody can touch it and take it away from us, What a great feeling that is. When I was a kid growing up, hardly anybody owned their own homes. Nearly everybody rented. Once in a great while, somebody would scrape together enough money to buy a little 3 or 4 room shack, and they would start making payments on that thing. And they would pay and pay and pay and pay and pay and pay for years, and the day that sucker was paid off, we had a celebration. We called in the neighbors, and we had a party, and we celebrated by burning the mortgage. What a great feeling that is. The only thing wrong with it, no sooner do you reach the goal, and you look around, and now this guy over here is driving a Cadillac, and I've still got a Chevrolet. This guy over here, he bought his suit at Brooks Brothers, and I bought mine at Kmart's. That causes me to create another goal. And I work and I work and I sacrifice and I reach the new goal. It doesn't last very long, and I create and set a new goal. It seems to create within we human beings an insatiable desire for more and more and more and more and more. We're not getting it fast enough. They're not giving it to us the way we think they ought to, so what do? We take shortcuts. We lie. We cheat. We con. We manipulate. We steal. And the instant we do so, we create pain and suffering for others. They in turn retaliate against us and create pain and suffering for us. Plain little life run on self-will can hardly ever be a success. Under those conditions, we're always in collision with people, places, and things. Third basic instinct he talked about is the sex instinct. I always have to stop and take a little drink of coffee before I start on sex.
He gets excited about this.
He said all human beings are born with a desire to have sex. He said it may get turned off by bad teachings and bad happenings. But he said all human beings are born with a desire to have sex. Because if we don't have sex, we can't reproduce ourselves. And if we don't reproduce ourselves, then sure enough, sooner or later, the human race is going to fail to survive. Now, just like the other 2 basic instincts, if you're going to reproduce yourself through the sexual act, you're going to have to work at it. But you older guys remember how it used to be? My God, we had sex, some of the hardest work you can possibly do. Only lasts about 3 minutes, if we can last that long. And you fall over sideways and the sweat's just pouring off of you. You can hardly get your breath. You feel like you've died and gone to heaven and come back 2 or 3 times. One of the greatest feelings that a human being can experience, both emotionally and physically, through the sex act. And I don't think we would do sex. I don't think we would do that much work if we didn't get a reward for doing so. And the great reward comes at the moment of successful completion of the sex act. One of the greatest feelings a human being can experience. But also, just like the other 2, it's just a temporary feeling. Hell, you no sooner get through with doing it than you get to thinking about doing it again. And it's such a pleasurable and such an exciting thing that the next thing you know, you get to thinking about doing it with different people. You get to thinking about doing it in different ways. You get to thinking about doing it in different positions. And the next thing you know, you're doing it at the wrong time, in the wrong way, with the wrong people. And the instant we do so, we create pain and suffering for others. They in turn retaliate against us and create pain and suffering for us. Plain little life run on self-will can hardly ever be a success. The fulfillment of these 3 basic instincts of life, God made it pleasurable so we would do so. And there's where the rub comes in. It is so pleasurable that left on our own resources, we cannot keep from overdoing and creating problems for other human beings. You know, if every human being on earth today, if they could fulfill these 3 basic instincts at the level God intended for them to be fulfilled at, there would be no conflict on earth today. But all human beings have self-will. And all human beings from time to time make decisions based on the satisfaction of these instincts. which create problems for others and in turn create problems for themselves. If you'll notice on that little picture, coming out of the three basic instincts, there's a thing called self. That's what makes up self-will. That's where it comes from. If you'll notice, coming out of self-will, there's another little circle called wrongs. It's a word you got to look at. Somewhere in AA we got the idea that the word wrongs was a list of dirty, filthy, nasty things. But you go to the dictionary and you'll find several definitions of the word wrong. One definition of the word wrong is incorrect judgment of others. And later on we're going to find out that's exactly what our resentment is. Another definition of the word wrong is incorrect believing. And a little later on we're going to find out that's what the majority of our fears are. Another definition of the word wrongs are the harms and the hurts that we do to other people. Now remember, we're trying to find a way to live where we can be sober and have a little peace of mind, serenity, and happiness. Where we can be sober and not be restless, irritable, and discontented. Not be filled with shame, fear, guilt, remorse, and etc. It is very easy to spot a selfish, self-centered human being. They will always display three common manifestations of self. They're always madder than hell. Damn him and damn her, and by God I'll show them, and they're not going to treat me that way, and blah, 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 blah. Selfish, self-centered human beings always scared to death. Can't depend on God. Can't depend on other human beings. If we're an alcoholic approaching the end of the road, we can't depend on ourselves any longer. And we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, but we know when it gets here it ain't going to be worth a damn, whatever it is. And we're running absolutely scared to death all the time. Selfish, self-centered human being in the fulfillment of these three basic instincts of life will always overdo and create harms and hurts for other human beings. And we're not drunken bums. We alcoholics have a conscience. And the guilt and remorse associated with the things that we do to hurt other people just literally eats us up. Now, a mind that is filled with resentments, madder than hell. A mind that is filled with fear. A mind that is filled with guilt and remorse doesn't feel good. And eventually that mind will start seeking a way to feel better. And for we alcoholics, we always go back to the sense of ease and comfort that comes at once by taking a few drinks. And we end up becoming insane, and we do it over and over and over and over and over. The only people that I see that fail in the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous are those that refuse to get rid of self-will and start operating on God's will. As long as we live on self-will, we don't stand a chance because of these three basic instincts of life. Joe?
So, let's go to page 62. It said selfishness and self-centeredness. That we think is the root of our troubles. We are driven by 100 forms of fear, self-delusion, self-seeking, self-pity. We step on the toes of our fellows and they retaliate. Sometimes they hurt us, seemingly without provocation. But we invariably find that sometime in the past we've made decisions based on self, which later put us in a position to be hurt.
Would you read the last statement again, please?
But we invariably find that sometime in the past we have made decisions based on the satisfaction of these basic instincts of life, which later put us in a position to be hurt. I want what I want when I want it. If I don't get what I want when I want it, I get very upset. You see, make decisions based upon self, which later puts me in a position to be hurt. So our troubles, we think, are basically of our own making. They arise out of ourselves, and the alcoholic is an extreme example of self-will run riot, though he usually doesn't think so. Above everything, we alcoholics must be rid of this selfishness. We must, or it kills us. And I say only God makes that possible. And there often seems no way of entirely getting rid of self without His aid. Many of us have had moral and philosophical ambitions galore, but we could not live up to them, even though we would have liked to. Neither could we reduce our self-centeredness much by wishing or trying on our own power. We had to have God's help.
One of the great mistakes we see people making in AA today is they're trying to make themselves better. And you can't make yourself better. Self cannot overcome self. A sick mind cannot heal a sick mind. We have to have God's help. The only thing that is stronger than our self-will is the one who made it in the first place, and that's God's will. We had to have God's help in order to be successful.
See, he told us how it works. Now he told us why it won't work. And now he's going to tell us how it really works. Okay? So this is the how and why of it. First of all, we had to quit playing God. It didn't work.
If this is a God-directed world, and everything I read today has convinced me that it is, then those of us who have been self-directed, and those of us that have been trying to direct everything and everybody around us, well, we've been trying to do God's work for Him. And we're not God. We got to quit playing God. We're going to try to be God-directed rather than self-directed.
Next instruction. Next, we decided that hereafter in the storm of life, God was going to be our director.
Not our suggester. Our director. You see, Bill agreed back there in the reading of how it works to change from direction to suggestions. But what he knew is later on he's going to put directions right back in the book. And from here on, it's not going to be suggestions any longer. It's going to be director and directions.
Now, he is the principal and we're his agents. He's the father and we're his children. Most good ideas are simple. And this concept was the keystone of the new and triumphant arch of which we passed to freedom. And I almost missed that little statement there. Because when I first started praying, I started praying like this. God help me get sober. God help me get my wife back. God help me to get a new house. God help me get a new car. Certainly I'm going to need more money. Get me some of that too. Get me a better job. I use God like you would an errand boy.
And oh, by the way, God, anything I've omitted, let me have that too.
Yeah. If I forgot something, give me that also. Well, you can see why that won't work. But I don't know any better. You see? But see, he's the father and we're his children. And after I've been sober a little bit while, I got reading that other big book. And there's a story in the front of that book that he said he worked for 6 days and then he rested. And to my knowledge, he never go back to work anymore. It looks to me like there's going to be work around here, done around here. It's going to be me doing the work. And I almost missed that simple little idea. He's the father. We're the children. He's the principal. We're the agent. He's the boss. I work for him. You see.
Remember back in Bill's story, we talked about he was going to paint a picture in our mind of a wonderfully effective spiritual structure, and willingness was the foundation. And then we said believing was the cornerstone. Now then he tells us what the structure is. It's going to be a new and triumphant arch through which we're going to pass to freedom. And deciding to let God be the director is the keystone of this new and triumphant arch. Now, back in the old days, before they had the mortar and stuff, the stones were all stacked together. There was a stone in the center that if it was cut right, all the other stones leaned against it. And that stone supported the arch. If the keystone was defective, it would fall out, the arch would collapse. The keystone of mine and your arch through which we're going to pass to freedom is the simple little idea that we're going to let God be the director. Those of us who have been self-directed, we're going to try now to let God become the director. Now, he also tied this wonderfully effective spiritual structure together with the word spiritual experience. See, we're building the spiritual experience as we progress through the program. We don't have to wait till we get to the last of it to get something out of it. Let's look on page 63, and let's see what the results will be by letting God be the director.
He said, now when we sincerely took such a position that he's the father, we're the children, most good ideas are simple, all sorts of remarkable things followed. We had a new employer. Being all-powerful, He provided what we needed if we kept close to Him and performed His work well. See, I thought He was supposed to perform my work well. I'm supposed to perform His work well, you see. Established on such a footing, we became less and less interested in ourselves, our little plans and designs. More and more we became interested in seeing what we could contribute to life. See, I'd always been a taker. Takers are losers. I wanted what I wanted when I wanted it. And if it was too big to carry, I lay down beside it and claimed it. That's mine. See? I was always a taker. Takers are losers, not only in AA, but in life in general. Takers are losers. You see the people out there successful, they're giving away and helping out. See, and people around AA that are successful, they're making the coffee, setting up the meetings and tearing it down and greeting people and doing the things, volunteering for the jobs. See, I was always a taker. Takers are losers. We'll see what I can contribute to life. As we felt new power flow in, as we enjoyed peace of mind, as we discovered we could face life successfully, we became conscious of His presence. We began to lose our fear of today, tomorrow, or the hereafter. We were reborn. And I used to hate those ideas about being reborn when I was drinking. Those people used to come over my house in the church about 3 blocks where I lived, and they won't talk to me about being reborn. And I said, boys, this is Monday Night Football. And you guys are in here talking to me about that stuff. And I'd run them off. Get out of my house and out of my yard and don't ever come back. See, it's trying to help me. And I didn't know it. I didn't understand what they meant by being reborn. I read in that other book there was a guy, his name was Nicodemus. Nicodemus was just like me. Dumb as a rock. I mean, he didn't know nothing. And he went to that fellow who was talking about being reborn, and he said, what do you talk about? What do you mean when you talk about being reborn? He said, you mean I've got to go back into my mother's womb and be reborn? And he looked at me like my sponsors have looked at me many times and shook their head. He said, boy, didn't you go to university? Aren't you smart? Aren't you educated? Don't you know you can't do that? He said, when I'm talking to you about being reborn, I'm talking about the renewing of your mind. Old ideas cast aside, new ones accepted. Dr. Jung said ideas, emotions, and attitudes, which were the guiding force of the lives of these people, are suddenly cast to one side. I have been reborn, not in my body, but in my head. I do not think like I used to think, and I do not do what I used to do, thank God. And I could buy these ideas that we've been talking up to this point. I can turn my will and my life over to this kind of God that I'm talking about now, a God of my own understanding. I can do that. And I couldn't wait till next Sunday morning to go to that church where they were asking people about 11 o'clock to come there and do the third step. Basically, it's what they're asking them to do. They'll be doing that someplace around here pretty close on Sunday morning. And I got down there about 2 or 3 minutes before 11. Well, I don't want to get there too early. I might hear something would help me, you know. So I got down there about 2 or 3 minutes before 11, and sure enough, they'd ask people to come down there and basically do the third step. And I went down there as humbly and as honestly as I possibly could, and sincerely. And this is what I did. See, we're now at step 3. We're ready to take the action of it. And I said, God, I offer myself to you to bear with me and do with me as you will. Relieve me of the bondage of self, that I may better do your will. Take away my difficulties, that victory over them may bear witness to those that I would help of your power, your love, and your way of life. May I do your will always, sincerely and honestly and humbly as I know how. And I don't know what happened that morning, but I do know this. From that day until this day, my life hasn't been the same. See, I know that. I went after that experience. I went over to my mother's house for dinner because I was divorced. Went over to her house for dinner, and she looked at me, and my name is Benny. She said, Benny Joe, that's what she called me. What happened to you? See, they always want to know what happened, don't they? What happened to you? You're different. Bill asked, Ebby, come, what's this all about? I queried. In other words, what's happened to you, Ebby? And I told my mom this. And my mom smiled. That's all she ever wanted for her kids. to live that way and to do this thing. And I did it. She was happy. A few weeks later, I went over to see Phyllis, try to make some amends to her. Before this, she wouldn't even call me. I mean, I'd call up her, she'd hang up on me. No way she was going to call me. My little daughter, she wouldn't even talk to me, you see. And how are you going to make amends for all of that? So I went over there to do that. And Phyllis opened the door. And if she was here, she would tell you this. She said, I was her Ebby. She said, there was something about my eyes. I was inexplicably different. And she wanted to know what happened. And I told her I was a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. I was trying to get our life straightened out. That's all I ever wanted either, too. And so we started going to some AA stuff together, slowly, over a period of a long time. They always want to know what happened. There's a story in that other big book. There's a guy in there, they asked him one day, said, what happened to you? He said, I don't know. He said, I was blind and now I can see. See, I was drunk and now I'm sober. I don't know what happened. But it all started with that decision. I know that, you see.
We thought well before taking this step, making sure we were ready, that we could at last abandon ourselves utterly to Him. I think the word utterly means completely, wholeheartedly, all the way, the full ball of wax. I hope you don't make the mistake I did. First time I did step 3, I'll go down on my knees, which I very seldom did in those days. And I said, God, I offer myself to Thee to build me and do me as Thou wilt. Relieve me the bondage of yourself, so on and so forth. And as I finish it up, I said, now this applies to my alcohol. Don't fool with my sex life. Stay out of my money. I can handle that too.
God probably said, water and order. I can't go through with it.
I said, you take the alcohol and I'll take care of the rest. Today I realize the fallacy in that is God probably doesn't even drink. I don't think He wants my alcohol. I think He wants me, and I think He wants all of me. That's what we're really deciding. Just think, if God could direct my thinking completely, entirely, probably it would become better in all areas. If my thinking becomes better, then maybe my actions will become better in all areas. Maybe not only do I not have to drink, but hell, my sex life might become better. My economic condition might become better. My relationships with other human beings might become better and better and better. We found it very desirable to take this spiritual step with an understanding person, such as our wife, best friend, or spiritual advisor. You know, this is really the first attempt that we're beginning to make to put ourselves back together as God intended for us to be. And if I do use this prayer in the company of another human being, then I'm beginning to put myself right with God. I'm beginning to put myself right with myself. And I'm beginning to put myself right with my fellow man. We are tridimensional creatures. We're meant to live with God, ourselves, and our fellow man. And this is our first attempt to really start putting ourselves back together in all 3 dimensions. In Dr. Bob's house, when they were still in the Oxford group, there was never any question about this. When the newer person was ready to make their surrender, the older person took them upstairs, 2 or 3 of them. They all got down on their knees in one of the bedrooms, and the new person made his surrender, which was their step 1, which is our step 3 today. And after they surrendered, then the older members would vote on how well he surrendered. If they didn't think he did it good enough, he'd have to go back and do it again to their satisfaction also. Always taking it with other human beings. Okay. One more little thing before we quit. I'm going to ask you to do a favor for me. You don't have to if you don't want to. But would each of you reach out and hold hands with those on each side of you, if you can reach them and everything. And I'm going to read this prayer. And as I do, I'm going to ask you to repeat it after me. God, I offer myself to Thee.
God, I offer myself to Thee.
To build with me and do with me as Thou wilt.
To build with me and do with me as I will.
Relieve me of the bondage of self.
Relieve me of the bondage of self.
That I may better do Thy will.
That I may better do Thy will.
Take away my difficulties.
Take away my difficulties.
That victory over them may bear witness.
That victory over them may bear witness.
To those I would help.
To those I would help.
Of Thy power.
Thy power.
Thy love.
Thy love.
And Thy way of life.
And Thy way of life.
May I do Thy will always.
May I do Thy will always.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
You'll never have to worry about taking step 3. You just took it. We'll see you all later on. Thanks for being here this afternoon.
My name is Joe, and I'm an alcoholic. Again, it's by God's grace in the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous and the program of Alcoholics Anonymous I found in a book called Alcoholics Anonymous, I'm Sober Today, and for that I'm very, very thankful. I want to tell you, since we're going to do a little inventory here tonight, I'm going to tell you a story. It's about a guy like Glenn, Charlie, and I. Oh, what's his name over there? I have a wonderful memory, it's just short. But Glenn and Charlie and I were about like these 3 little boys, and they were in the 6th grade, and they were about 22, 23 years old. You have to kind of get the picture. And the principal wanted them out of the 6th grade desperately. So he called them in one day and said, boys, I'm going to ask you all a question. If you get an answer to these questions, you can go into the 7th grade. Good. So he looked at Glenn and said, now, Glenn, what is it that women have 2 of that men like to get their hands on? And he thought for a long time, and finally he said, well, men like to hold women's hands. He said, that's good, Glenn. Now you're in the 7th grade. He looked at Charlie. He said, now, Charlie, what is it that that men have one of that women like to get their hands on? He thought for a long time, and finally he said, men have one billfold. Women like to get their hands on a man's billfold. He said, that's good, Charlie. You can move on to the 7th grade. He looked at me and he said, now, Joe, I'm going to ask you a simple question. I said, God, I hope so. I missed those first 2. The main problem of the alcoholic centers in the mind.
Are you through?
I'm through.
Okay, last session we had, we finished up with step 3. We made our decision. We uttered the words from a 3rd step prayer. Our decision was that we're going to turn our will, which is our thinking apparatus, and our lives, which is our actions, over the care of God as we understood Him. And always, always remember, it originally said over the care and direction of God as we understood Him. In the narrative, it said that we had made the decision to let God be our director. He's the father, we're the children. He's the employer, we're the employee. And that's the first time we've had that relationship with God in a long, long time. We got certain results out of that we read on page 63. Now we go down to the bottom of page 63. And we see what we're going to have to do in order to carry out this decision. And on the bottom of page 63 it says next.
Next instruction.
We launched out on a course of vigorous action. The first step of which is a personal house cleaning, which many of us had never attempted. Though our decision was a vital and crucial step.
Step 3.
It could have little permanent effect unless at once followed by strenuous effort to face and be rid of the things in ourselves which had been blocking us. Our liquor was but a symptom, so we had to get down to causes and conditions. Now, we hear people all over the country asking this question: how long should you wait to do step 4 after you've done step 3? And we hear all kind of answers. I hear some people answer back, well, maybe 30 days. Some of them maybe 60 days, maybe another one say 90 days. We heard a professional in the field counseling people to wait a minimum of 2 years to do step 4 after step 3. And our question back to that professional was, how many people have you killed with that statement? See, we're trying to find a way to live where we can be not only sober, but we can be peaceful and happy and free and have a little peace of mind and serenity and happiness. And the longer we put off step 4, the longer we're going to remain restless, irritable, and discontented. The longer we're going to remain filled with shame, fear, guilt, and remorse. And a mind that is filled with those kind of things does not feel good. And the mind wanting to feel better for we alcoholics, eventually we start thinking about the sense of ease and comfort that comes at once by taking a few drinks. And next thing you know, we've become insane again. We've convinced ourselves it's all right to drink. We take a drink, trigger the allergy, and end up drunk all over again. I don't know how long I could go between step 3 and step 4 without getting drunk. And really, I'm not too interested in finding out how long I can go. The big book tells us when we ought to take 4. It says 3 is not going to have any good effect unless followed at once by an effort to face and be rid of the things within ourselves which have been blocking us. And that does make sense, doesn't it? As far as I can remember back, 4 has always followed immediately after 3, whether it be in the inventory process or whatever. Now, knowing that, and knowing if we don't take step 4, we might end up getting drunk over it, then why would we tend to continue to procrastinate and put it off and put it off and put it off? Probably for 2 or 3 different reasons. Number one, I found that a lot of the old-timers in AA like to play king off of the mountain with step 4. And they like to tell the newcomer how tough it is. By God, you just wait till you get to step 4. Blah, 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 blah. And we just literally scare them to death. Fear keeps us from taking step 4 many, many times. I think, though, the major reason that we continue to procrastinate on step 4 is because we don't understand how to do it. The instructions on taking step 4 are here in the big book on page 64. But they are so short and sweet and simple that we alcoholics with our keen intellectual alcoholic minds have overlooked the simplicity of it and complicated the hell out of it. So we didn't know how to take it. But we did get a little further in the book in step 5, and we read something about sharing all your life story. And we thought, oh, that must have been what they wanted us to do then in step 4, is write our life story, and then we could share that with somebody else in step 5. That's what I did in the beginning. That's what nearly everybody was doing when I came into AA. Now, my life story probably wasn't too important to other people, but it must have been to me because I had about 92 pages in it. And I took it to another poor, suffering alcoholic. And he read it and he said, "It's not very pretty, is it?" I said, "No, it isn't." He said, "Well, you'll never have to be that way again." And he threw it in the waste paper basket. And I learned nothing to contribute to my alcoholism from the writing of my life story. Perhaps if he had really understood the program, he could have helped me see some things. But all I got out of it was confessing, period. Now, as I look back at that time, I realize then 95% of my life story has nothing to do with my alcoholism anyhow. The fact that I was born in 1929, I don't think that's got a thing to do with my alcoholism. It may have something to do with somebody else's alcoholism, but not mine. The fact that I graduated from high school at age 17 went immediately into the service. I don't think that's got anything to do with my alcoholism. The fact that I was married at age 21, I don't think that's got anything to do with my alcoholism. But I tell you what it did do. The 95% that had nothing to do with it very effectively covered up the 5% that did. And I learned nothing to contribute to my alcoholism through the writing of my life story. So then in our confusion, somebody in Minneapolis, Minnesota wrote a 4-step inventory guide. And we got the Minneapolis guide, we combined it with the big book, and we got more confused yet. Somebody in Dallas, Texas wrote a 4-step inventory guide. And we got the Dallas guide and combined it with the Minneapolis guide and combined it with the big book, and then we really got confused. I have no idea how many inventory guides are floating around out there today. We saw one time that had 20 pages in it. And I'll guarantee you, if you wasn't crazy as hell before you took it, you would be when you were through with it. It was one of those kind. And all the time, the instructions have been right here in the big book on page 64. We just didn't understand them. And the reason we didn't understand them is we didn't know how Bill Wilson writes. We had not at that time realized that he loves to use an example of something we already know to teach us something new. We didn't realize that Bill does not like to repeat himself using the same word. He'll always go find a different word, meaning basically the same thing. Now, bearing those two things in mind, his tendency to use something he knows that we know about to teach us something new, his tendency to repeat himself but use different words, let's just kind of sit back and relax, and let's see if we can't really see the simplicity of step 4 in the Big Book Alcoholics Anonymous. Let Joe and I be the first to say, there's nothing to be afraid of in step 4 done the way the Big Book says to do it. It's not going to be a list of dirty, filthy, nasty items. Mm-hmm. There is nothing in here that is so complicated that we can't understand how to do it, providing we understand how Bill Wilson writes. Let's go to the first paragraph on page 64. Therefore, we started upon a personal inventory. This was step 4. Now, he is immediately going to jump into business. And here's his first comparison between a business inventory and a personal inventory. He assumes that we know something about a business inventory. A business which takes no regular inventory usually goes broke. And I think we could probably all agree with that.